Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the country everyone thought was too small, too poor, and too isolated to matter in one of the most contested stretches of ocean on the planet had just become the most strategically important piece of real estate in all of Asia. That is exactly what is happening right now in the Philippines, and the ripple effects are being felt all the way to Beijing, Washington, Tokyo, and beyond. This is not a story about politics for the sake of politics. This is a story about power, about water, about fish, about oil buried beneath the ocean floor, and about the extraordinary lengths that great nations will go to when they believe the future of the world hangs in the balance. And at the center of it all sits a small archipelago nation of over 7,000 islands whose fishermen have sailed the same waters for centuries, whose coast guard has been rammed and water cannoned and harassed repeatedly, and whose government has just secured something that has left military analysts and foreign policy experts scrambling to update their assessments. The Philippines just locked in $2.5 billion in American defense funding, and if you think that number is just about buying weapons, you have not been paying close enough attention. Let us start with geography, because geography is destiny, and in the South China Sea, geography is everything. The South China Sea stretches across roughly 3.5 million square kilometers of ocean and serves as one of the most critical maritime corridors on the entire planet. Over $3 trillion worth of global trade passes through it annually. The fish stocks alone feed hundreds of millions of people across Southeast Asia. Beneath the seabed lie enormous reserves of oil and natural gas that have barely been tapped. And sitting right in the middle of this extraordinary body of water, straddling the contested features, the shipping lanes, and the strategic choke points, is the Philippines. For decades, the Philippines was largely left out of the major power calculations of the Indo-Pacific. The country had a turbulent political relationship with the United States that dated back to 1992, when American military forces left their permanent bases on Philippine soil and an era of deeper partnership seemingly closed. China saw this and moved aggressively. Within just a few years of the American departure, Beijing had already begun quietly establishing a foothold in the Spratly Islands. By the 2010s, China was building artificial islands at a pace that stunned the world, turning reefs and sandbars into military outposts equipped with runways, radar installations, and weapons systems. The Philippines had filed a landmark legal case against China under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. In 2016, an international arbitral tribunal ruled decisively in Manila's favor, invalidating China's sweeping territorial claims in the sea. Beijing simply declared the ruling a piece of paper and moved on. That moment revealed something critical. Legal victories, no matter how historic, mean nothing without the power to enforce them. The story of what is happening today in the Philippines cannot be understood without going back to the presidency of Rodrigo Duterte, who led the country from 2016 to 2022. Duterte made a dramatic pivot toward Beijing, publicly embracing Xi Jinping while openly insulting American officials and questioning the value of the US-Philippines alliance. He dangled the possibility of joint resource exploration with China in disputed waters and downplayed the ramming and harassment of Philippine vessels by Chinese ships. The United States watched this with deep concern. The Philippines, under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement signed in 2014, allows American forces to rotate through 9 designated bases across the archipelago. These sites are positioned in locations of enormous military significance, including areas facing the Taiwan Strait and the contested waters of the South China Sea. Losing the Philippines as a cooperative partner would be a devastating strategic blow for Washington. When Ferdinand Marcos Jr. succeeded Duterte in 2022, the entire geopolitical calculus shifted. Marcos moved swiftly to reactivate and deepen the alliance with the United States. He opened additional sites under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, accelerated joint exercises, and began pushing back publicly and forcefully against Chinese aggression in the West Philippine Sea, which is the Philippine term for the portion of the South China Sea within the country's exclusive economic zone. The transformation was swift and it was noticed immediately in Beijing. China's response to the Philippine strategic reset was not diplomatic. It was physical. Rather than attempting to negotiate or find a new modus vivendi with a more assertive Manila, Beijing doubled down on coercive tactics at sea. Philippine resupply missions to the Second Thomas Shoal, where a small contingent of Filipino sailors lives aboard a deliberately grounded warship called the BRP Sierra Madre to assert sovereignty, became a flashpoint of confrontation. Chinese Coast Guard vessels began using water cannons against Philippine boats attempting to bring food and supplies to those sailors. Chinese ships rammed Philippine vessels. Filipino sailors were threatened by armed Chinese personnel at sea. In August of 2025, a collision near Scarborough Shoal between a Chinese Coast Guard vessel and a Chinese Navy destroyer during an attempt to expel a Philippine ship resulted in the Chinese Coast Guard vessel being severely damaged, with reports suggesting at least 2 Chinese personnel died. Beijing has never acknowledged the incident. Shortly after, China unilaterally declared a portion of Scarborough Shoal a national nature reserve, an act that Philippine officials and international legal experts widely condemned as a blatant sovereignty assertion with no legal standing. This is the environment in which the United States decided to commit $2.5 billion to Philippine defense. When the United States Congress passed the 2026 National Defense Authorization Act in December of 2025, buried inside the enormous $900 billion Pentagon policy legislation was a provision authorizing up to $500 million per year in foreign military financing grants for the Philippines from 2026 through 2030. That totals $2.5 billion over 5 years. This is not aid in the traditional sense of the word. This is structured military financing designed to give the Philippines access to advanced American weapons systems, communications technology, and defense platforms that Manila has long wanted but could not afford. The legislation also comes with something even more significant than the money itself. It comes with a signal. When the United States Congress writes a 5-year defense commitment into federal law, it is telling allies and adversaries alike that this is not a temporary policy preference that might reverse with the next administration. It is an institutionalized commitment. Defense analysts in Manila, Washington, and Tokyo took note immediately. The Philippines, for so long the underdog in the South China Sea standoff, was being armed, trained, and backed in a manner that changed the strategic math in ways that Beijing had not anticipated when it chose the path of coercion over negotiation. One of the most consequential developments in this entire escalating situation has been the deployment of the Typhon mid-range missile system to the Philippines. This land-based missile launcher is capable of striking targets at considerable distance, including ships at sea and land-based installations. When it was first deployed on Philippine soil during military exercises, China's reaction was visceral and immediate. Beijing demanded its removal, issued formal diplomatic protests, and used state media to warn of destabilizing consequences. The intensity of China's reaction told analysts everything they needed to know about how seriously Beijing views this development. A ground-based missile system in the Philippines capable of reaching contested maritime features and, critically, capable of threatening Chinese military installations in the South China Sea represents a genuine deterrent capability that the Philippines did not previously possess. American defense planners have been rethinking the entire concept of how to deter China in the Pacific for years. The old model relied on large, expensive, and increasingly vulnerable aircraft carriers and forward bases. The new model emphasizes distributing smaller, mobile, and lethal capabilities across the island chains of the Western Pacific, turning the geography itself into a defensive advantage. The Philippines, with its 7,000 islands stretching across key maritime approaches, is central to this reconceptualized strategy. The joint military exercises that have been taking place between the United States and the Philippines have grown dramatically in scale and sophistication. The annual Balikatan exercise, which translates roughly to shoulder, has evolved from a counterterrorism-focused training event into a large-scale conventional warfare rehearsal. In recent iterations, American and Philippine forces have practiced scenarios that include repelling amphibious invasions, conducting long-range precision strikes, and coordinating naval and air forces across vast distances. American F-35B fighter jets have dropped precision-guided munitions on maritime targets during these exercises. The two countries are planning to hold over 500 joint military activities in 2026 alone, a number that reflects the dramatic intensification of the alliance. Beyond Balikatan, exercises like Sama-Sama have brought together the naval forces of 5 countries including the United States, the Philippines, Japan, Canada, and France for live-fire gunnery drills, anti-submarine warfare training, and surface warfare exercises in the exact waters where China's vessels have been most active. The presence of French warships in particular surprised many observers, signaling that European powers with interests in the freedom of the seas are beginning to physically commit to this contested region in ways that go beyond diplomatic statements. The role of Japan in this unfolding story deserves particular attention because it represents one of the most significant strategic realignments in Asia since the end of the Cold War. Japan and the Philippines signed a mutual defense agreement that took effect in September of 2025, the first such agreement that Japan has entered into with any country other than the United States under its post-war security framework. This is an extraordinary diplomatic and military milestone. Japan, which has its own deeply contested territorial disputes with China in the East China Sea over the Senkaku Islands, recognized that its security interests were directly connected to what was happening in the South China Sea. A China that successfully coerced and dominated the Philippines would be a China that felt emboldened to push harder in the East China Sea. Tokyo moved to close that gap. The Nimitz Carrier Strike Group conducted its largest show of force near Scarborough Shoal in years in November of 2025, joined by Philippine and Japanese vessels in a 9-ship formation that was impossible to interpret as anything other than a deliberate demonstration of combined power. China responded by deploying H-6 bombers equipped with long-range anti-ship missiles to monitor the exercise. The confrontation, while not kinetic, was a stark demonstration of how rapidly this situation could escalate. The United States Marine Corps deployed a unit equipped with MQ-9A Reaper drones to the Philippines in November of 2025, at the request of the Philippine government, to support maritime domain awareness operations. These are large, high-endurance surveillance aircraft capable of monitoring vast stretches of ocean and feeding real-time intelligence to surface vessels and command centers. The deployment, described as temporary and with unarmed drones, nevertheless represented a meaningful expansion of the surveillance and information-sharing architecture that the United States and Philippines are building together. In the South China Sea, information is power. Knowing where Chinese vessels are, what they are doing, and where they are heading gives Philippine and American commanders the situational awareness they need to respond appropriately to provocations and to document incidents for the diplomatic and legal record. China has long benefited from a degree of opacity in its maritime operations, conducting harassment in areas far from cameras and witnesses. Drone surveillance changes that calculus. Every water cannon fired, every ramming incident, every dangerous maneuver by Chinese vessels now risks being captured on video and shared with the world, creating accountability that China has so far been able to avoid. The establishment of a joint US-Philippine military task force announced in October of 2025 represents perhaps the single most significant structural development in the bilateral alliance since its founding in 1951. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Philippine Defense Secretary Gilbert Teodoro unveiled Task Force Philippines on the sidelines of the ASEAN Defense Ministers Summit in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The task force, the first of its kind in Southeast Asia, will be led by a brigadier general or rear admiral and include approximately 60 dedicated staff members. It covers the full breadth of the Philippine archipelago and is designed to allow American and Philippine forces to respond much more rapidly to provocations and crises in the contested waters surrounding the islands. Unlike previous joint mechanisms that were largely administrative or advisory in nature, this task force has an operational mandate. Analysts described it as a game-changer in terms of response time and coordination capability. Where previously the two militaries would need to work through slower channels to coordinate responses to Chinese provocations, the task force creates a standing command that can act decisively and quickly. China has relied on the slowness of Allied decision-making as a tool of coercion, presenting allies with rapid fait accompli situations before a coordinated response can be mounted. The task force is designed specifically to close that window of opportunity. The Philippines has also moved aggressively to develop its own domestic defense infrastructure in ways that were unthinkable just a few years ago. Balabac Island, a quiet and strategically positioned island in Palawan province near several South China Sea hotspots and the strait separating the Philippines from Malaysia, has been selected as a new military base dedicated specifically to South China Sea operations. Philippine Marines and Coast Guard Special Forces have been conducting joint maritime boarding exercises in the waters around Balabac, and the island is among the 9 sites across the Philippine archipelago where American-funded facilities will be built under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. American funding is going toward infrastructure, fast boat facilities, communications equipment, and logistics networks that will allow the Philippines to sustain a much more assertive presence in its own waters. Philippine troops, who spent decades focused almost entirely on counterinsurgency operations against domestic armed groups in Mindanao and the Cordillera, are being rapidly retrained and re-equipped for conventional territorial defense scenarios. The Philippine Army is practicing counter-landing drills, port and airfield recapture exercises, and anti-invasion scenarios in northern Luzon, the region most proximate to Taiwan and most exposed to any potential spillover from a cross-strait conflict between China and Taiwan. That last point cannot be overstated. Philippine Military Chief General Romeo Brawner told commanders in the Northern Luzon Command to begin planning for contingencies in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. He specifically referenced the need to prepare for actions beyond the country's northernmost island near the southern tip of Taiwan. The Philippines has a direct security interest in the Taiwan question that goes beyond ideology or alliance obligations. A Chinese military operation against Taiwan would be launched through waters and airspace that are immediately adjacent to Philippine territory. The Luzon Strait, one of the critical maritime choke points between the Pacific and the South China Sea, lies between Taiwan and the Philippines. American forces responding to a Taiwan contingency would almost certainly need access to Philippine bases, whether formally acknowledged or not. China knows this. It is part of why Beijing has worked so hard in past years to cultivate influence in Manila and why the Duterte-era pivot toward China was seen in Washington as such a serious security threat. The Marcos administration's clear alignment with the American-led security architecture has restored a critical link in the chain of deterrence that stretches from Japan through the Ryukyu Islands, through Taiwan, and down through the Philippines to the broader Pacific. There is a human dimension to this story that statistics and geopolitical analysis alone cannot capture. The Filipino fishermen who have worked the waters around Scarborough Shoal for generations have found themselves caught in the crossfire of a great power competition they never asked to be part of. For years, Chinese vessels blockaded the shoal and prevented Filipino fishing boats from accessing the rich marine life of the Bajo de Masinloc, the Filipino name for the feature, to which they have historic and legal rights. Families who depend on those waters for their livelihoods were turned away at gunpoint, their catches confiscated, their boats damaged. The sailors aboard the BRP Sierra Madre, the rusting hulk deliberately grounded on 2nd Thomas Shoal, have lived in extraordinarily difficult conditions, resupplied sporadically through missions that involve running a gauntlet of Chinese water cannons and vessel-blocking maneuvers. These are not abstract security challenges. They are the lived experience of ordinary Filipinos whose government has finally decided to push back and whose allies have decided to stand with them. The $2.5 billion in American defense funding, the Joint Military Task Force, the Reaper drones, the missile systems, the Carrier Strike Group patrols, all of it ultimately traces back to this basic question of whether a smaller nation has the right to its own waters. China's public response to all of these developments has followed a predictable script. Beijing has condemned each new deployment, each new exercise, each new defense agreement as provocative, destabilizing, and a Cold War mentality that serves no one's interests. Chinese state media has portrayed the United States as an outside power stirring up trouble in a region that would otherwise be peaceful. The People's Liberation Army Southern Theater Command has sent warships and aircraft to monitor joint exercises, including the deployment of H-6 bombers armed with anti-ship missiles to observe the Nimitz Carrier Strike Group drills near Scarborough Shoal. China also responded to a five-nation allied naval exercise in October of 2025 by initiating its own parallel military drills and installing unmanned surveillance buoys at Scarborough Shoal for the first time. A Chinese Su-35 fighter jet dangerously intercepted a Royal Australian Air Force surveillance aircraft in international airspace over the South China Sea during the same period, releasing flares near the Australian plane in what Canberra condemned as unsafe and unprofessional behavior. These Chinese countermeasures reveal the central dilemma Beijing faces. Every escalatory response it makes reinforces the Allied case for the very military buildup it seeks to prevent. Every water cannon fired at a Philippine vessel, every dangerous intercept of an Allied aircraft, every unilateral declaration of a nature reserve on a disputed shoal adds more nations to the list of countries willing to send their warships to Philippine waters in solidarity. Australia's involvement in this situation is worth examining carefully because it illustrates how broadly the security concerns generated by China's behavior have spread. Australia has no territorial claims in the South China Sea. It is not a treaty ally of the Philippines in the same formal sense that the United States is. Yet Australian warships have participated in joint naval exercises alongside American, Philippine, and Japanese forces in the disputed waters. An Australian surveillance aircraft was intercepted by a Chinese fighter jet in international airspace over the region. Australia has consistently and vocally backed the 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling that went in the Philippines' favor. Why? Because Australia's trade routes pass through the South China Sea. Because Australia understands that a China that successfully establishes the precedent of ignoring international law and dominating smaller neighbors through sheer military pressure is a China that will apply that same playbook wherever it calculates it can get away with it. The rules-based international order that Australia, Japan, the United States, France, Canada, and the Philippines are trying to uphold in the South China Sea is not just about fish or oil or uninhabited reefs. It is about whether the fundamental principle that might does not make right continues to hold in the 21st century. The political situation within the Philippines adds a layer of complexity that outside observers sometimes miss. Former President Rodrigo Duterte's daughter Sara Duterte, who served as vice president under Ferdinand Marcos Jr., has been described as the frontrunner for the presidency in elections scheduled for 2028. Sara Duterte shares her father's historical leanings toward Beijing and has publicly distanced herself from the Marcos administration's pro-American foreign policy stance. Security analysts and American defense planners have been acutely aware of this political reality. It is one of the reasons why there has been such deliberate effort to institutionalize the US-Philippines alliance through legally binding legislation, multi-year funding commitments, standing task forces, and treaty-compliant infrastructure that would be very difficult for any future Philippine administration to simply cancel with a phone call. The Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement sites being built across the archipelago represent physical and contractual commitments that embed American and Philippine defense cooperation into the landscape of the country in ways that cannot be easily undone. The $2.5 billion authorization passed by the United States Congress is similarly an institutionalized commitment written into federal law. These are not favors between friendly leaders. These are treaty-level arrangements designed to outlast any single administration in either country. The economic dimension of the South China Sea competition is frequently underappreciated in coverage that focuses primarily on military hardware and naval confrontations. The sea contains enormous proven and potential reserves of hydrocarbons. The United States Energy Information Administration has estimated that the region holds billions of barrels of oil and trillions of cubic feet of natural gas, though estimates vary significantly. The fisheries of the South China Sea are among the most productive on the planet and represent a critical food security resource for the hundreds of millions of people who live around its shores. China's expansion in the sea is not simply a military or strategic calculation. It is an economic one. By establishing control over the waters, reefs, and features of the South China Sea, China gains access to these resources while simultaneously denying them to the smaller nations whose exclusive economic zones contain them under international law. The Philippines has seen this play out directly. Chinese vessels have driven Filipino fishermen from traditional fishing grounds, and Chinese maritime enforcement has been used to obstruct Philippine energy exploration activities in areas that are unambiguously within the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone under the 2016 ruling. The deployment of the new US-Philippine Joint Task Force has accelerated what analysts describe as the transformation of the Philippines from a passive recipient of American security guarantees to an active partner in regional deterrence. Philippine defense officials have been explicit about this shift in mindset. Defense Secretary Teodoro, speaking at the ASEAN Defense Ministers Summit, called on smaller nations to stand against what he characterized as Chinese antagonism, framing the Philippines not as a victim seeking protection but as a sovereign nation exercising its rights and inviting partners to join it in doing so. This rhetorical positioning matters enormously in Southeast Asia, where many nations have historically tried to avoid taking sides between Washington and Beijing. By framing the issue as one of sovereignty and rules-based order rather than great power rivalry, the Philippines has made it easier for countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei, all of which have their own overlapping claims in the South China Sea, to identify with Manila's position without feeling that they are being pressed into an anti-China alliance. The Philippines is essentially building a coalition of interest around the principle that the 2016 arbitral ruling, and the international law it reflects, must be respected. Military analysts who study the balance of power in the South China Sea have noted that the cumulative effect of the developments of 2025 represents a genuine shift in the strategic environment. The deployment of mid-range missile systems, the establishment of the Joint Task Force, the 5-year American defense funding commitment, the Japan-Philippines Mutual Defense Agreement, and the sustained presence of allied navies in the disputed waters have collectively altered the risk calculus that China faces when it considers coercive actions in the region. Before these developments, Beijing could reasonably calculate that the costs of harassment and provocation were low. Philippine forces lacked the capability to respond effectively, American commitments were politically uncertain, and other regional nations were unlikely to involve themselves. Each of those calculations has now changed. A Philippine military equipped with American-financed precision weapon systems, supported by a standing joint task force with American personnel, backed by a Japan that has committed to mutual defense, and observed by allied surveillance drones and carrier strike groups is a very different proposition than the Philippines of even 3 years ago. This does not mean that conflict is inevitable. In fact, the argument that defense planners in Washington and Manila are making is precisely the opposite. A credible deterrent reduces the probability of conflict by eliminating the conditions that make aggression seem low cost and low risk. There is a broader lesson here that extends well beyond the South China Sea and the specific case of the Philippines. It is a lesson about the relationship between investment in alliances and the maintenance of peace. For much of the post-Cold War era, the prevailing assumption in many Western capitals was that economic integration, trade relationships, and diplomatic engagement would gradually moderate the behavior of rising powers and draw them into the existing rules-based international order. That assumption has been fundamentally challenged by what has happened in the South China Sea. China became the world's second-largest economy and a central node in global supply chains, and it simultaneously ramped up territorial revisionism, ignored binding international legal rulings, and systematically harassed smaller neighbors to enforce claims that have no basis in international law. The lesson that policymakers in Washington, Tokyo, Canberra, and Manila appear to have internalized is that economic interdependence does not automatically produce security or respect for established norms. What produces security is a clear and credible demonstration that attempts to change the status quo through coercion will be met with a response that makes the costs of coercion outweigh the benefits. That is the logic behind every element of what is being built in and around the Philippines. Where does all of this lead? That is the question that keeps strategists, diplomats, and military planners awake at night. The optimistic scenario is that the combination of strengthened Philippine capabilities, deepened American commitment, expanded Allied involvement, and Japan's new defense partnership creates a deterrence architecture robust enough that China recalculates the costs of continued coercion and chooses a path of negotiation and de-escalation. There are precedents for such recalibration in international history when a country pursuing revisionist aims encounters a credible and united response that changes its assessment of what is achievable. The pessimistic scenario is that Beijing, facing internal economic pressures, demographic challenges, and a leader who has consolidated power to a degree that makes acknowledging failure politically dangerous, doubles down on assertiveness in the South China Sea as a means of sustaining nationalist legitimacy at home. In that scenario, the risk of a miscalculation, an accident, a provocation that spirals beyond anyone's intention to control, grows with every additional warship and every additional confrontation at sea. The men and women making decisions in Washington, Manila, Tokyo, and Beijing all understand this. Whether that understanding is enough to prevent the kind of incident that neither side wants but both sides are increasingly positioned to trigger is the defining question of our era in the Indo-Pacific. The Philippines, for its part, has made its choice. It is standing in the water. And for the first time in a very long time, it is not standing there alone.